Okay, so this is the video discussing the introduction of our book. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend you pause and go and do that. It's only 9 pages. As you'll discover in the course going on, the amount of pages you have assigned any given week is pretty small. And due to that, I absolutely expect you to read them. Does that make sense? So when we talk about stuff in these videos and stuff we do in class related to them and so on and so forth, I do assume you've read it. However, I also assume that it's a bit different hearing my take on it than your initial impression. But how are you going to have your own opinion if you don't read it yourself first, right? And in there, you'll see Van Patten's opinion, you'll have an opinion, and you'll hear my opinion. Now, the reason why it matters is that one of the goals of this particular class is to have some practice making argumentation. This is going to show up on the content assessments, and there are 3 of them, and then there's a final, okay? So it is important to make sure that you have read, that you're aware of the multiple positions within each question, which we'll talk more about next week, and that you're able to have an opinion based upon the evidence that's presented, right? To be able to defend that based on things we have discussed, okay? Not my personal experience. I will ask you for your personal experience in some cases on the homework, but when it comes to making argument on an assessment or the final, I do need it to be made on evidence. Personal experience is anecdotal, it is not evidence, okay? Trust me on that. All right, so if you haven't read these pages, you then pause and you read them and now you're back. Cool. All right, so the introduction to this book kind of gives you a sense of what is SLA, second language acquisition, which at some point I'm going to forget to bother to tell you what it is, so hopefully you will have had it by that, you will have it in your brain by that point. But SLA, and so we will talk briefly about kind of the picture leading up to where we are now. And within that, you'll kind of get a sense of the issues that we've been discussing and some of the variance that there is in this field. So the first question that I ask, and in a typical semester where we're face-to-face, this is pretty much the first slide that you see when you walk in the door. What is second language acquisition, right? And the reason why I ask this question, it's always because we don't, this is again personal experience, right? What we think we're doing when we're in a language class and what's actually happening often are not the same thing, right? So here are some definitions. According to Gasbeni and Plonsky, it is the study of how learners create a new language system. That suggests that your brain is doing stuff. Or Gass and Selinker, so Susan Gass you see in both of these. The field of second language acquisition is one about which everyone seems to have an opinion. Yes, they do. Even a casual airplane conversation with a seatmate during which we're asked what we do. So if someone asks me, what do you do? If I were to say that I study second language acquisition, right? So continuing on with the quote, always elicits opinions about second language acquisition, some of which are accurate and some of which are not. One of the first things people say is, oh, I'm terrible at learning whatever. It's the very first thing. And it's such, and that's A, nothing to do with acquisition itself. B, it's not really understanding what it is, right? And people really, really, really have an opinion, many of which based upon memorizing verb endings or Lord knows what. Okay, so what is the significance of learner errors? So in this particular intro, one of the guiding principles that kind of drives the first several decades, and to some degree currently, but mostly the previous decades, our understanding of how second language acquisition occurs is built around learner errors. And that's something like if I'm speaking and I don't say something correctly, so for example, if I were speaking English as, let's say, a second language learner, and I were to say, John walked to the store, right? Walk with nothing on it is not the morphology you would expect. You would expect John walks to the store. Or if I was in the past, I might have intended to say something meaning John walked to the store in the past tense, right? So learner errors gives us a picture into the mind. Now, quarter 1967, we're kind of moving back slightly. originally observed the systematicity, right, the reoccurrence of certain types of errors, and what he suggested was an internal syllabus, right, things our brain's looking for and does in a certain pattern that was guiding second language acquisition. You'll also see L2 acquisition. Usually L2 is used in comparison to L1. This is L1. If you saw my intro video, I know little to no sign, but not for lack of desire. L1 acquisition. And so sometimes you're going to see that. If they bother to write L2, it's because they're going to write out the word acquisition after. Usually it's in contrast. There's just such a thing as L3 as well, but that's a discussion for a different day. Anyway, internal syllabus, which is kind of sort of what people believe for L1, depending on who you ask. He also determined there was a difference between input and intake. So input is everything you hear in the environment, and intake are the things in the environment you incorporate or you understand into your linguistic system, right? So if I, as a learner, have heard John walked, John walked, John walked, John walked, I may have heard it, but it may have never incorporated itself in my linguistic system. Now, this is unlikely to completely not have, but it is possible. So it's not necessarily intake absorbed just because it's there, right? Selinker 1972, and if you noticed, Selinker is one of the authors in the definitions from the previous slide. He proposed that L2 learners have an internal linguistic system, right? That we have intuitions, that we have a biological representation of language like a native speaker, like L1 speakers, and that internal linguistic system is in fact worthy of study. And to me, this seems really obvious, but in 1972, no one had really thought of that. They were like, oh, because this is back on the heels of behaviorism's role in linguistics, where language was just stimulus production. But as we've learned in 185 and other places, language is too creative to simply be stimulus response, right? We say lots of things we've never heard before. And if it was just stimulus response, why would that happen? So anyway, Selinker says we should really study it. This is important. Within that, he proposed the word interlanguage. That means it's basically the mental representation of language. Despite what the word sounds like, we're not proposing that this representation is some corrupted or incomplete or messed up version of what a native speaker of that language would be, right? So my Spanish, for example, will never be 100% like a monolingual Spanish speaker for many reasons, including the existence of another language. In that way, bilinguals are never exactly the same as two monolinguals. It's always slightly different because of the contact. It's something that our brains do with the contact of language. We're never exactly like a monolingual, and we should never try to be. It doesn't work that way, but it's beside the fact. But since the word interlanguage is talking about this linguistic system, we need to move away from viewing it as a corrupted version of a native language and look at it as just an existing linguistic system with its own characteristics, right? And this is what Selinker proposed. And within this, he mentions that sometimes in the process of creating this linguistic system, this interlanguage, right, we do something called L1 transfer, and you'll see here that's L1 because in contrast to L2, that we're transferring from our first language, right? So my English showing up in my Spanish, someone else's English showing up in their ASL, whatever it is, this is L1 transfer, and it definitely happens. Definitely. No one can avoid it. It does happen, right? And the other piece that Selinker had in here is fossilization, which is to say that sometimes in our acquisition process, we kind of hit a wall and we stop, right? People talk about a plateau in learning. Fossilization is basically that, right? And so these things happen, and we need to know why they happen, okay? By the way, as you're reading our book, and we'll talk a little bit about this in class, or have talked about in class depending on when you're watching this video, these words on this page, when you're reading them in the intro, many of them were bolded. Bolded words appear in the glossary of our book. And if they're bolded, you're responsible for them, okay? There is a definition section on your assessments, your content assessment 1, 2, and 3, and the final. And even though they're open book and all that, it's going to save you time if you know them, okay? So please take this seriously. The word intake, The word input, they mean something. Interlanguage, you need to know that it's not just some corrupted, poor version of something, right? It's a linguistic system. It's unique and it's interesting. Okay, so be careful of bolded terms. There's a bunch on this page. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the 70s and the 80s, not in extreme detail because we don't need to, but you'll see some patterns, okay? So in the 1970s, we see some support for Quarter's internal syllabus, such as predictable acquisition orders. So for example, I learned some basic verbs, and then I learned a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I haven't memorized the orders, but we'll talk about some examples in the semester. But you learn things in a particular order, right? And this is what was found for L1 acquisition, right? So it mirrored L1 acquisition, and that both involve stages of development. You know, I have to make sentences before I can do the endings correct, before I can do this, right? It's not like it just goes like that and it's done, okay? And in this case, the error analysis, you know, where we go, wow, they're doing this one wrong, so they haven't learned it yet. This is heavily used in this methodology. And then in the 80s, a guy named Stephen Krashen shows up. And Krashen is most well known for monitor theory, right? Monitor theory has, you should go to page 141 of the glossary and you should read about it, okay? We're not talking in detail at this particular moment, but it counts as a bolded technical term for this course. Because remember, this book is called Key Terms in Second Language Acquisition, okay? So terms matter. Monitor theory in particular is a theory having to do with the role of input in second language acquisition. And it makes very specific predictions. And we can talk a little bit more about this in class. But the idea is that we can only absorb what we're ready to absorb. The formula is generally considered I plus 1, which is to say what you already understand, except for slightly above that. Because then, you know, your linguistic system goes, I don't know how to, excuse me, I don't know how to do that. I guess I should learn how to do that, right? So it's I plus 1. He also says that input drives acquisition, which is in contrast to the behavioral output-driven models of the day, or even before him. Again, behaviorism-based models of language. The input drives acquisition. And so that's just, it was very important what he was doing in that time period. Lydia White, she was in the 1980s a big proponent of a linguistic theory and universal grammar approach to second language acquisition. Full disclosure, the authors of her book are also believe in universal grammar, but not every linguist does. It's not something we talk about a ton in our program because it takes a lot of time away from what we're doing, but it is relevant to second language acquisition. And towards the end of this semester, you guys and me are going to talk about this in a little more detail. Why we think second language acquisition, and by extension, first language acquisition, are guided by universal grammar. What would it mean for it not to be? Okay, and this appearance in second language acquisition shows up. Salinger was a UG or two, but shows up in more force in the 80s with Lydia White. And then Manfred Pieneman is his name, is very much into speech processing and how that affects stages in learner output. So being able to process, which is say assign structure to in real time, things when you're hearing and then actually producing guides the stages that we talked about with the internal syllabus. So these are the kind of broad swath things. Monitor theory, input driven, not necessarily UG, but compatible with it. White, specifically UG, and then Pieneman, processing oriented. And in the 90s, we see the same thing. We see connectionism, you see more universal grammar, we see processability theory, and something called sociocultural theory. And connectionism, like UG, is compatible with monitor theory, which says that second language acquisition is an association, just like we do any other learning activity. It's about learning skills, right? It suggests that learning a language is the same as riding a bike. You just got to do it enough times. Sort of, not exactly. Universal grammar was really interested in things like transfer from L1, access to UG, what's causing this learning. That's the focus is also different, but you see that pattern sort of repeats. Processability theory and input processing, including stuff from Pieneman himself, showed up in more in the 90s. So we're seeing a pattern, a continuation of the ideas from the 80s. And then finally, social cultural theory was sort of born in the 90s. We'll talk about it, I think, in the last week of class. But it is this interesting other kind of kind of approach to the phenomenon of language acquisition that if you're in our interpreting classes here, you will notice it shows up there, right? So it's interesting to think about how it's applicable to second language acquisition more generally. And that's not the focus of most of the research of SLA, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we will talk about it nonetheless, okay? So the definition of that is language acquisition is a negotiated social phenomenon, okay? 2000s, again, same idea. UG shows up, connectionism. Connectionism gives birth to a version called emergentism, and usage-based, which is frequency-based learning. Input processing is still there. Sociocultural theory is still there. So things just keep growing and growing and growing. Okay, important question for us to talk about. What is the relationship between pedagogy, teaching, and SLA? Okay, and those of you in the K-12 track for French and Spanish, this question is really relevant for you guys, like really relevant. But it's something we should all ask ourselves because many of us, probably most to all of us, are in second language classes, right? We're taking ASL, we're taking Spanish, we're taking French, we're taking German, we're taking whatever, right? Chinese. And we are students experiencing pedagogy. And so if a particular instructor's approach doesn't work for us, it may just be that person's pedagogy just doesn't sync with you specifically. Maybe it works for your classmates, maybe it doesn't. So there is a relationship that even as if you're just a learner, you should ask yourself that question. But if you're in the K-12 track, you should definitely ask yourself that question. There's a big, big question here. One thing I'll say though is that pedagogy and SLA generally have different motivations and they ask different questions. So despite needing to understand their relationship and think about how they talk to each other, there is some kind of a live in different tracks, okay? But we kind of need to purposely try to come back and talk to each other. Pedagogy is looking at effective teaching. It is looking at people's ability to communicate and affect learners' internal states, right? For example, I do both these things. I'm an SLA researcher and I teach languages. So they kind of have similar, my pedagogy questions are very practical. It's literally, how do I stay in the target language? How do I make sure I'm understood? How do I present this in a clear way? These are very specific, but that's not what the SLAer in me asks, right? SLA is the understanding of the internal mechanism and constraints on learnability. What do I expect my learners to get from me, right? There are limitations to what I think classroom exposure in one semester in 15 weeks can do. And so when I create those kind of classes, since I'm also an SLAer, I'm asking myself, what is reasonable, right? But I'm also saying memorizing a bunch of grammar points for me is not really indicative of having learned a language because it's not the same thing. It's not. It is not. So they ask different questions and their motivations are different. They can be connected, right? So in particular, there is a subgenre, a subfield, if you will, of SLA called instructed SLA, ISLA, which their sole goal is trying to take SLA type motivations and procedures and research questions and kind of tack them on top of research on pedagogy, right? And then asking pedagogy questions guided by SLA. So Van Patten and Bonatti's our other author, on the 8th page of the intro make this quote. Unfortunately, from our perspective, the author's perspective, language teachers are often woefully undereducated in the general findings of SLA. If you haven't yet watched the video, Where Are the Experts, which is the video I made on Van Patten's article entitled Where Are the Experts, it sinks in directly to this question. Right in, right? Because Van Patten makes the case that the kind of people that are either teaching other teachers how to teach or are creating a model for people to look at, right? Those same people who are sort of at the head of the pedagogy field, many of them are not linguists. And at times they miss out on the findings that linguistics has found about language education, about language acquisition, right? Because acquisition is kind of the internal state and pedagogy is kind of external, and they relate. But because they aren't the same things, sometimes pedagogy tends to ignore linguistics sometimes. You'd be careful about that. In fact, every SLA course in the history of mankind for pedagogy, right, pedagogy methods, including the ones at USM, are like Krashen. Krashen's important. And if you remember, Krashen is from the 80s. I mean, he still gives talks today for $200 some a seat, but he's only one person. So pedagogy tends to be a little behind the science, okay? If you're going to only go with one person, Krashen's fine. A lot of things he says I agree with, it's fine. But it is only one person 30 years ago. I was born in the 80s, and I'm older than most of you. Like, come on. Okay, so that's the way I'm going to leave us off. It's a particular video. This last quote, if you haven't already watched Where Are the Experts? This particular quote relates directly to that and makes the case that the experts are scarce, let's say. Okay? All right.